Hello again everybody. Today's talk is going to be about Alexander the Great, one of the famous names from the ancient world, but not one of the longest lasting. He was born in 356 BC in Macedonia. He was the son of Philip II of Macedon and Olympias. Philip II is an interesting character, very much a military man, but he was buried in a big tomb, and he is one of the few people whose body, identifiable as an individual, has been excavated from the ancient world. So we know where he was buried, and we know what his skeleton looks like. Anyway, Alexander was born, and he was educated partly under his father's influence, but also very much under the influence of the leading intellectual of his day, who was called Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, the famous philosopher, one of the greater intellectuals of all time. One of the things that came about from his education was his reverence for the poetry of Homer, in particular the Iliad of Homer. And it was said that to the day he died, he kept a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow. I think that may be a slightly apocryphal story, because given the nature of ancient books, that would have been quite a sizable book. But still, maybe it was kind of the highlights of the Iliad. Very influential on Alexander, even so. So when he became king, he became king after the assassination of Philip, who was assassinated as he went into the theatre. One of the famous names. Some American presidents were assassinated in the theatre. Maybe not quite so dangerous nowadays. Anyway, he succeeded his father and continued on Philip's aggressive expansionist policy. First of all, he subdued Greece, and then he moved on to Asia, the province of Asia, which nowadays is largely speaking Turkey, fought in the famous Battle of Issus, of which this is an illustration, a famous mosaic from Pompeii, which is now in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. Darius, the Persian king, was defeated at the Battle of Issus, but his family were captured, and it's interesting that Alexander, rather than executing them or using them as hostages, actually treated them famously leniently. He went on from there. He captured Syria and then Egypt, which had been under Persian influence. And while he was there in 331 BC or thereabouts, he founded the city of Alexandria. Now, there were a number of cities called Alexandria, and indeed a number of cities called Philippi. If there's a city called Philippi from the ancient world, that's named after Philip II of Macedon. Alexandria is named after Alexander the Great, his son. So that's one of their most influential things, historically speaking. There were tensions as he went further east. People began to question whether he was trying to go too far and make his empire too big. By this time, Alexander was drinking heavily, and in a row with one of his generals called Clytus, in a drunken rage, he hurled a spear at him and killed him. He was full of remorse, but this didn't stop him executing other people who fell foul of him, including his longtime advisor Parmenio. He went on from there, carrying on east through what is now Iraq and Iran, into northern India, perhaps also into Afghanistan. But by this time, many of his soldiers were on the point of revolt and just wanted to go home. They'd been campaigning more or less continuously for years, and they wanted to go back to their homes and families. By now, Alexander was at the grand age of 30 years old. He returned, but he'd annoyed many along the way. And one of the things he'd done that had annoyed people was who he'd married. He'd married 3 times altogether, and people thought he should have been marrying a Greek or a Macedonian, but he didn't. This outraged Aristotle, amongst others. And he'd also taken to wearing Persian clothes, and that didn't go down too well either. On his way back to his homeland, he was in what is now Iraq. First of all, his longtime companion Hephaestion died, and shortly after, Alexander himself died in Babylon in 323 BC. The relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion has been much speculated over, but most likely it's a similar relationship to the one between Achilles and Patroclus as described by Homer in the Iliad. So, his tomb, however, he was actually buried in Alexandria, and other people much later, including Augustus, were very keen to visit his tomb because by that time Alexander really was known as Alexander the Great. So what was he like, and was he a good leader? He was very driven, he was ambitious, certainly prepared to be ruthless. If somebody crossed him, he was prepared to kill him. We might say he was maybe a megalomaniac. Others have said that yes, he just needed to be a strong leader in order to keep his empire held together. He was interesting because, as well as being a great military man, he continued to love arts and literature. Maybe he extended his empire too far in the end, and he didn't listen to advice until it was too late. Maybe some of the leaders of our own day should take heed from this, and rather than trying to extend their influence too far, they should be thinking about listening to advice and not being driven too much by personal ambition. He had the reputation of being very much a man of the people, and he ate the same as his soldiers, drank the same as his soldiers, and slept alongside his soldiers rather than having king's privileges or an emperor's privileges. So he became revered both during his lifetime and indeed after his death. He was not averse to a certain amount of deification during his lifetime, and there were others afterwards who continued to add to this mythology. Roman leaders were very keen on him. Augustus visited his tomb. Julius Caesar borrowed the model of a statue by the famous sculptor Lysippus, and a number of other Roman leaders did likewise, just keeping everything the same up to the neck and then changing the head. He drank too much, and this affected his judgment. For instance, when he murdered Clytus. But it was said by the sources that he was restrained in other pleasures of the body, despite his relationship with Hephaestion and indeed his 3 wives. He meddled in the Middle East and into Asia. Didn't end well for him, that. He was a very skillful general, but ultimately, once he died, his empire started to fall apart. He was very well read, but ultimately, maybe not the man for today. I wonder whether his influence is more from his mythology rather than what he actually did.